In October 1980, during one of his final interviews, John Lennon was asked for his thoughts on Paul McCartney's recent work with Wings and whether he was ever surprised by his former bandmate's creativity. Lennon responded by saying that he was never really surprised, comparing it to knowing a sibling so well that nothing they did could truly be unexpected after knowing them since the age of 15. He had a point. The bond between Lennon and McCartney was so close that it resembled a brotherhood. Even a decade after the Beatles had gone their separate ways, their deep connection still lingered. Countless biographies and books written about them have consistently shown that Paul and John's relationship wasn't overly complicated. They shared mutual admiration and respect, despite their differing personalities and the slight age gap. Both came from similar backgrounds, growing up in post-war Liverpool just as the sound of American rock and roll was making its way across the Atlantic. They were bitten by the music bug at the same time. They shared a non-verbal understanding. Just a glance, a smirk, a raised eyebrow, or a playful expression was enough for them to instantly know what the other was thinking. As individuals, they were different but complemented each other in both character and musical sensibility. Their singing voices blended effortlessly. Unlike many other groups, the Beatles were truly a band in the fullest sense, not a single frontman with a backing group. They functioned as a unified whole, famously described by Mick Jagger as a four-headed monster. Within this unit, John and Paul naturally emerged as the unofficial leaders. George Harrison once commented in the Beatles anthology that there was a clear attitude from John and Paul that positioned them as the Grooves, while he and Ringo were expected to follow along, not through any explicit words or actions, but rather through a shared dynamic that placed John and Paul at the forefront. As songwriting partners, John and Paul had a special kind of creative rivalry. It was never about envy, but rather about challenging one another to push boundaries and reach new heights. That dynamic defined their relationship from the moment Paul was invited to join John's school band, the Quarrymen, in late 1957, all the way through the Beatles' peak years, especially during the early studio-focused era after they stopped touring, around the time between Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It was during this period that Yoko Ono entered John's life, a conceptual artist from Tokyo who was known among London's avant-garde art circles, but was otherwise relatively unknown. At the time, Lennon was married to Cynthia, whom he had met while attending Liverpool Art College before the Beatles had even begun. Yoko, too, was married and had a young child, much like John. But when they met at London's Indica Art Gallery in November 1966, something intangible passed between them. An instant, almost spiritual connection. Both of them felt it. Their relationship didn't become physical until about 18 months later, when they finally acted on their feelings. Unfortunately, it happened under painful circumstances. Cynthia returned from a holiday earlier than expected and caught them together. With Yoko now a central figure in John's life, the two became inseparable. Like many people in the throes of a new romance, they were constantly at each other's side. But in doing so, they broke one of the Beatles' long-standing unwritten rules. No partners or spouses were allowed in the recording studio. Yoko began attending every recording session with John at Abbey Road Studios. Ringo, the last to join the group, and often considered at the bottom of the band's unspoken hierarchy, didn't seem to mind. But for Paul and George, her presence in the studio was unsettling. It introduced a new dynamic that they found awkward and difficult to navigate. Paul would later admit that he had a hard time coping with Yoko's constant presence. On one hand, he was troubled by the feeling of losing his creative partner, yet on the other, he didn't want to offend John or Yoko. He wasn't even sure how to bring up the issue with John in a way that wouldn't cause tension.